And I'll just give you a little background on Dave before he gets started, and then he can add anything else he wants. But Dave has spent much of his career with the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, progressing from an aquatic biologist to the director of the Environmental Assessment Program. In that latter role, he had responsibility for monitoring Maine's waters and development of the state's water quality standards. A primary focus of his work has been the establishment of biologically based water quality standards and assessment techniques. Presently, Dave works for the Nature Conservancy as a freshwater science and policy analyst, and at the TNC, the Nature Conservancy, he is engaged in a variety of water-related conservation projects in Maine, the greater US, and internationally as well. So yeah, without further ado, I'll turn it right over to you, Dave. Feel free to embellish on any of your introductory stuff there, but we're excited to hear about your project and how it relates to aquatic entomology. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. No further embellishment needed. That was plenty. Thanks. Appreciate the invitation to talk about the Maine Aquatic Biodiversity Project. And this is actually, the project is a good 10 years old now. This was stuff that was done in the early 2000s up through about 2010. We completed the front end of the project. Give a little background about how it all started. Back in the 1990s, there was a forest biodiversity project, which I was invited to participate in, which was essentially a group of the major landowners in the state of Maine and conservation organizations or whatever. It was organized by the Nature Conservancy. And the purpose of that was to kind of consolidate information we had about biodiversity. There was a lot of information, a lot of interest in conservation work and kind of doing directed conservation at protecting our biodiversity. And this was initially involved the lands across the state of Maine. We didn't have a whole lot of conservation or lands in conservation at that time. There was an effort to start to identify primary targets to do conservation. One of the outcomes of that was a finding that people said, gosh, we don't know much about the aquatic biodiversity. And that seemed to be an important element. I mean, both when you're looking at land conservation, you need to consider the waters that are inherent in that. So this was a spin-off of that forest biodiversity project. And it involved the 4 agencies and organizations at the bottom of the screen there: Nature Conservancy, the DEP, Maine Inland Fish and Wildlife, and the university. So that's how it got started. And I would have to point to an individual that we hired, Peter Vo, for this job, who was really instrumental in pulling together the information that I'll talk about tonight. So it's going to be a quick overview of kind of what we learned from that project. So move ahead. So here's an image of aquatic biodiversity, and I think I assume everybody on the call tonight has some image in their mind of what they think aquatic biodiversity is. And then this is an image I have of aquatic biodiversity. So any image that you have is perfectly fine. I'm not about to change it, but hopefully I'll give you a little more information as we move along that might kind of have you rethink a bit about what aquatic biodiversity is. So let's see. So what is biological diversity? Well, it's, variety of life in all its forms and at all levels of organization. And sorry, Mike. Oh, there we go. So the levels that we think about are ecosystem level, which in terms of aquatic diversity, we think of at the watershed level, and then community level, which are water body types, and then species biological diversity, which I think is what everybody thinks about of what biological diversity is. It's all the various species that are out there on the landscape. And this is mostly what I'm going to focus on later on is this species diversity. And then the last is genetic diversity, which is more and more important these days. And I'm not going to talk about genetic diversity. This was not a focus of the project, and I'm not qualified to talk about it. So aquatic biodiversity includes all those species that require water immersion for at least some part of their life cycle. So you and I might go swimming and immerse ourselves in the water, but we're not part of the aquatic biodiversity. We don't require it. So starting at the ecosystem level, if you look at Maine, we're kind of unique. This was an interesting point that we found as we were kind of looking at data and what we're saying. And this applies both to the land and to aquatic diversity. But we have these three major influences. Certainly the coastal influence from the ocean, the southern, hardwood, softwood, southern influence that comes in the lower southeast or southwest part of the state, and then the boreal influence. And then overlaid with that, well, just I should point out that all those white lines in there are the various ecoregions that have been defined within the state of Maine. So it's not just the three big blobs there, but then there are other ecoregions that are defined in part by vegetation, geology, climate, whatever. Then overlaid with that to the right are the ecological drainage units. So we have four major drainage units. Southern Maine, one being areas like the Saco River, Salmon Falls River, and so forth. And the large one in the center in the blue is Androscoggin, Kennebec, and Penobscot. These are large river basins. And then the down east area, which extends over into New Brunswick. And then in the north, we have the St. John. These all have some unique kind of diversity differences. So that's the ecosystem level. Then looking down at the community level, communities are described, by water body and kind of features of those water bodies. So in the large group of that, we have things like lakes and ponds, which are defined by size and depth and chemistry, rivers and stream, which are size and gradient, wetlands, which are defined a lot by the water source and vegetation, whether permanent or ephemeral, and then specialized things like groundwater, subterranean waters, pitcher plants, tree holes, and then I always like to throw in sewage plants because they do have a unique biodiversity unto themselves. Although again, this was not part, sewage plants were not part of the Aquatic Biodiversity Project. So natural communities, kind of as I said, are influenced by geology, chemistry, topography, climate, hydrology, biological things. The Maine Natural Areas Program defines 9 riverine community types and 12 lake community types. And just to the right, I was just showing a scatter of a few different community types and kind of how they arrange themselves. So the green dots are high elevation lakes, which have unique fauna to themselves, and obviously are in the Western Mountains area. The orange dots being alkaline lakes, so you see a cluster up in the Aroostook County area, another one down in central Maine, which are areas where there are limestone bedrock sources. And then some of the other ones we plotted here are just things like fishless ponds, which tend to overlap a lot with the high elevation lakes, mostly because the fish couldn't get there. But also there's a cluster of those down east, which tend to be acidic lakes, where the fish simply can't tolerate the lower acidic or higher acidic low pH in those waters. So just an idea that these things are not random across the state. They do have some clustering of different community types. Let me go the other way here. Okay, so now we'll get to species diversity, which is really what we're going to talk about the rest of the evening here. So species diversity, this is at the taxonomic level, and also called species richness. Actually, richness is the, you might say, the count of different species or different taxa that we encounter. Species diversity often has a different meaning to it in terms of kind of distributions of species. So anyway, when we get to species richness, we look at native species richness. Those are ones that are occurring in Maine naturally, and then kind of subcategories of that are endemic species. These are ones that are regionally distinct to Maine or to the Northeast anyway. Transient species, these are ones that come in and out of the system. They're not there all the time. And these would be things like diadromous fish, which come in seasonally, spend a portion of their life in, and then leave the freshwater system and go elsewhere to the ocean. And there's introduced species. These are ones that have been transplanted by humans. And then a subset of that are the invasive species. These are introduced species that have a detrimental effect on the native species, if there's an interaction going on with those. And then total species richness is all the, it's a summation of all of the above. It's the natives, the transients, and the introduced. So I'll discuss some of those, give you a few, well, species counts when we get to that part. So one kind of caution or whatever when we get into this study is our understanding of biodiversity is all about effort. It's however much effort you put into searching for and identifying the various species that we have out there. So the more you look, the more you find. It's, this project, if nothing more, told us how incomplete our knowledge is, but it still gives us some good information. I mean, there are some groups that we have studied well, and then there's still some, such as the nematodes that are in the plate to the left there, which we don't know at all. And I remember reading a piece from Neil Wilson a number of years ago where he was saying he thought nematodes, there may be more species of nematodes than there are all other multicellular species at all. So it's groups like that, where we spent very little effort, we just don't know much. And then there's some that we do. So here's some species counts for you to look at. Fish 65. That should be 67, but I can change that. Amphibians 18, turtles 10. You can read down through that, but these are groups where we have done fairly good statewide assessment of what's out there. Certainly not complete. We're always finding more. As I said, it's all about effort. And just to show since that slide was from 2010 or 2012 or so, just in that time, just to update it to today, we have 2 more fish species. Surprising, in fact, interestingly, one of them is a native species. We just had never found it, which is the brook lamprey. Was only discovered a few years ago in southern Maine. Was always expected to be here. It's found in southern New England, and there was no reason to think that we wouldn't have them at least in that southern zone that I was showing. And indeed, it was eventually discovered. And then the other one was an introduced one, which is the rock bass, which we knew was in New Hampshire, in the Androscoggin River, but had never been detected in Maine until recently. So here's a case, where the counts are going up slowly. And then the other one I know there, the dragon and damselflies, originally was 158. In my understanding, it is now 159, although I don't know what that new, it was just a new piece of data I saw not too long ago that indicated that another one had been added to the dragon and damselfly survey that the state has done. So a lot of these, if you look at this, the fish data is certainly the best. It's probably about as complete as you could expect for an area of the state of Maine. And that's because of, long years and years of work by Inland Fish and Wildlife to assess the fish populations in the state, both in rivers and lakes. So that one's, really well known. Amphibians are another one that's very well known. Plants, less so. We have pretty good handle on it, but it's one of those ones where we're always finding something new, and particularly we're finding invasives or at least introduced species that are coming in once in a while. The other ones, mussels, there's been a statewide survey for mussels. Crayfish, the same. Mayflies was a study, well, a number of studies, but the most recent one was early 1990s by Steve Burrian, which was really looked at all the historic material, and then was added a lot of collecting that went on with that, similar with stoneflies, black flies, caddisflies. So these are all groups that have been pretty well studied. So the numbers are probably pretty close to being exact or real. So, so how are we doing, particularly with these groups here? So fish, we have 69, I'm sorry, that should be 67 species. There's an error there. 49 native and 18 are introduced species. So looking at North America, how are we doing in Maine? How is our diversity compared to North America? And so we have, of the 69 species, that's about 8% of all the species in North America. For crayfish, we have 7 species, which is about 2% of all the crayfish species. Mussels, we have 10, which are 1% of the North American species. Mayflies 170, which is about 30% of all the North American species, and stoneflies 123, or approximately 21% of all North American species. So the question I'll just throw out for you, and people can answer in the chat if they want, but why the difference? Why are fish and crayfish and mussels so make up such a small percentage of kind of the available biological diversity that's out there, whereas the mayflies and stoneflies make up a much higher percentage? So people can have fun with that little question. So a few other things. How are we doing? You know, how are the well, in this case, how are the fish doing in terms of trends? So at the state and watershed level, the number of fish species are increasing. We have 49, and we now had 49 native species, presumably sometime back in before we started introducing or bringing fish in. We now have 67 species. So that's, you know, it's an increase, but native species at the water body level are actually decreasing. And this is because of competition from the introduced species that are coming in. Things like a lot of our native minnows are, particularly at the water body level, are disappearing. Even though we still have them statewide, they may not be present in water bodies that they historically were in. Crayfish are similar to fish. You know, we have 4 native species and 3 non-natives, and then 1 more expected. And I see Matt Scott's on the call tonight, so he can fill anybody in on what the current status of crayfish are, because a lot of this information came from him. Plants, we have around 130 native and introduced species. We don't know exactly what the number of introduced ones are. Some of these came in, who knows when, and was never documented, you know, whether they're native or introduced. They've been here too long. They've naturalized, if you will. But we have been paying a lot of attention lately to invasive plant species, of which we have 6. And these are the ones that kind of create detrimental, have detrimental effects on native species and just on our use of the water. So these are ones, mostly, I don't think we've had any invasive species known in Maine until about the 1980s. We're surprisingly clean when it comes to that. But there are, we expect, about 13 potential species out there which could find their way in here. And then of the 6, 2 are from other places in North America, and 4 are from another continent. And we have 31 listed water bodies. We add about 1 a year. So not a lot of invasive problems yet, but it's, again, it's one of those things that's growing, and the more we look, unfortunately, the more we find. So threats to aquatic biodiversity. And these are just, you know, how we rank the threats to particularly native biodiversity. So at the biological scale, you know, we look, is it at the species level, community level, landscape, or in this case, watershed level. Then spatial scale, watershed or statewide, duration, years, decades, or more. And then are there alternatives to these threats, and whether they're reversible, whether you can mitigate the threat, or whether it's non-reversible. So just a quick summation of the kinds of threats that the state faces. Pollution, which was certainly an important factor a few decades ago. effects at the species and community level. And then if you look across, I mean, it's largely reversible. We've had a lot of good success removing pollutants and restoring aquatic biodiversity. Flow alteration, similarly, it occurs, it affects the communities. It's at the water body level, and it's reversible. Habitat alteration, again, is at the community level in terms of biological effects. Spatially, it's at the water body level. And then it can be mitigated. And I particularly want to note dams in that these affect both at the water body and watershed level. And yes, it can be reversed if you remove the dam. Sometimes it can be mitigated. Invasive species, again, you know, these affect at the water body or watershed level. Generally are not reversible, particularly introduced fish and plants. There's been a little bit of success in removing invasive plants, but largely these are not reversible. And then climate change. Got to throw that in because that's the big one. That's the elephant in the room. You know, and that, you know, the biological effect, the spatial effect, these are, it's statewide. And the duration, we have no idea how long it is, and is it reversible? Probably not. About the best we can do is kind of slow it down, or at least optimistically stop it where it is, but I don't think we'll ever reverse it. So just, we don't know. So I'm going to sum up or end up with a few things. I want to talk first about species at risk, or, you know, endangered species. And if you look at this graph, and this is from 2000, although, I mean, 20 years later, I think it's pretty relevant in terms of the relative effect of what we see in terms of species at risk across, this is across the US. In that, you know, things like, you know, freshwater, excuse me a minute, I'm gonna take that. Okay, sorry, thought I jumped my slides here, but if you look just at this, I mean, in terms of aquatic biodiversity, the first 5 bars on the graph are all aquatics. And then there's a few others as you go down through, and things like birds and mammals are at the bottom, you know, which obviously we pay a lot of attention to in terms of species at risk, but clearly our aquatic flora and fauna are under duress. And so in Maine, I thought I'd, here are the Maine endangered and threatened species. We have, these are aquatic species. We have 5 listed fish. 3 of those are federally listed, 2 are state listed. Mussels, 3 of the 10. Mayflies 2, dragonflies 3. And then if you look, the numbers in parentheses are species of concern. So these are ones where we don't really know. They haven't they haven't made the list of being threatened or endangered, but certainly are being watched. And interestingly, just the picture to the right there, the dwarf wedge mussel, is an interesting one. We don't have dwarf wedge mussels in Maine. They occur to the west of us in New Hampshire and Connecticut River Valley. They occur to the east of us in New Brunswick. We've searched for them here in Maine and never discovered them. So it's one of those ones. Do we have this species? Why don't we? Why are we in the middle of their range, but we don't seem to have them in the state of Maine? So certainly, if we ever find the dwarf wedge mussel, I assume it would make this list. So I guess I'm going to end, since this is an entomological group, kind of focused a lot on things that aren't entomological, but I wanted to end talking about a tale of two mayflies, and these are our two threatened and endangered, well, threatened mayflies in the state of Maine, the Toma mayfly and the Roaring Brook mayfly. And the reason I wanted to talk about those is they landed on the list for different reasons, certainly good reasons. They belong there for that matter. But the Toma mayfly, it's one I'm personally interested in. I was actually standing next to Cassie Gibbs in 1978, looking in the same pan with her when she said, "Oh my, that's different." And as it turned out, Cyclonisca erygemia was unique. It had not been seen or documented anyway. It was first described in 1909 from state of New York, the Sacandaga River. Had not been documented. I think it's been seen a few places until we found it in 1978. And this was part of a project I was involved with. We were looking at effects of spruce budworm spraying on aquatic ecosystems. And we were working over in the Toma Stream area in a wetland there, and found this insect. And then brought it back to the lab and keyed it out. And it was like, oh my, this hasn't been seen in many decades. Actually, I was fortunate. I was at the time, I was a grad student at the time, and was on my way down to Florida A&M University to meet. I was working with midgeflies and doing a project on that, but I was going down to meet with a specialist down there on midgeflies, but also at Florida A&M. That's kind of the center of mayfly taxonomy, with Will Flowers and Bill Peters and whatever. So I brought these down to them, and they just went nuts to see these specimens that we brought down. So that's the Toma mayfly that was rediscovered in 1978. And then the Roaring Brook mayfly was one that was first described in 1939, I believe, first found by Frison, for whom it's named. And it was described, but then nobody ever really followed up on it, and was never certain whether it was a unique species or not. We have a number of epiorhis in the state of Maine that occur in these flowing habitats. And some of the work that Steve Burrian did indeed documented that, yes, this was a unique species unto itself. And then further work through Inland Fish and Wildlife and all kind of documented the presence of this, that yes, we did have it. And they're unique. Here's the two different habitats. On the left is the Cyclonisca habitat. And Cyclonisca is unique. It's a stream mayfly, but it in springtime it moves into these sedge meadows on the edge of the stream, where it grows. It's actually a predatory mayfly, which is quite unique. Very large, very distinctive. If you see one, you'll know you're seeing something different. And realize that this was a species. Not only was it rare or hadn't been seen for a while, but really had some very unique life requirements, because it would live in the stream, but then needed to get out into these flooded sedge meadows in the springtime where it would grow and become a predator on other mayflies, and emerge and then redeposit its eggs back in the stream again. And actually at the time, you know, I said we first discovered this rediscovered it in 1978, and then a lot of work that was done by Cassie Gibbs and her students, Marcia Sieberman and others. There's a whole number of publications out tracking what we've learned about this particular species. And anyway, at the same time, back in the 1980s, we learned that the Potomac stream, the area particularly here where we found mayfly, was due to be flooded. Inland Fish and Wildlife thought, you know, Potomac stream was excellent duck habitat and wanted to enhance it for duck habitat. And when we heard that, it was like, oh, you might want to wait on that. You know, we've got a rare species here. So anyway, they never built the impoundment. Unfortunate, because if you look at the history of the species, as I said, it was first discovered in the Sacandaga River in New York and never seen there again. And that's because that was a habitat that was flooded by a dam and kind of extinguished that mayfly and its existence. And then, you know, on the right is the Roaring Brook mayfly, which is a high elevation species, occurs in these, you know, high gradient headwater streams, cold water, and is probably kind of a relic species from kind of the post-glacial period, and is now kind of exists only in these high elevation habitats. So just move. So here's what we know about the distribution of these two species. Is, you know, on the left is the Toma mayfly. You know, we put on a good search for this. You know, Toma stream is, you know, where the arrow points there is over on the New Brunswick border. Subsequently, we looked at sites all over the state of Maine to see if we could find this, because right now there's no current information where it exists outside of the state of Maine. There are some surveys that have been done back in the 50s or 60s. There is one site in New York where it's has been found, I think was in the 60s or 70s. There's a couple of sites in Quebec. It's been searched for in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. It has not been found there. And there's 13 sites in Maine right now. So very limited distribution, and that's mostly because very distinct habitat requirements. These flooded spring sedge meadows are where we find this. Then over in the for the Roaring Brook mayfly, you know, it was first described in Baxter Park in the Roaring Brook area, and a search has gone on elsewhere for that, and it has been found again in only high elevation headwater streams, and it has been found over the White Mountains in Vermont, but that's the extent of or the range of that species. So these are clearly unique, kind of endemic species, endemic to Maine, that we want to offer that protection for. So with that, I'm going to close, only to say, if you want more information about the aquatic biodiversity study, and there's sources. First of all is the summary report, which is available from the Maine Natural Areas Program. If you scribble that URL down real fast, I can sends out to people if they want. The databases and the references are available again from the Maine Natural Areas Program. The technical report is there, and if you go into the appendices, you will see both the sources of the data for which the biodiversity study was done, and also there's you'll see a lot of listings of occurrences by species, and depending on where it is, it's by county or and based on the information that we had. And then the last one that I would point you to are species maps, and these are available. Some of them are on the Maine Natural Areas Program, but the lakesofmaine.org website, if you go into their the conservation button on their page, there's you go into their species mapper, and this has, you can actually pull up maps for species, and it has essentially everything that we have in the database that is geolocated can be loaded into onto a map, so you can actually look and see what the distribution of fish, insects, mussels, whatever, and you can actually load in several species at a time. So if you want to see, is there convergence of two species or something like that? It's fun to play with if you want. So, and with that, I will close and take the questions.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Dave, for that presentation. So yeah, reminder, folks, you can get your questions into the chat box. Otherwise, once I get through the ones that are already there, you can feel free at this point to turn your cameras on, raise your hands, or unmute if it's relatively quiet. You can ask Dave questions directly. So first one, question from Kathy. Dave, this was on the slide where you were kind of showing the different eco-regions or whatever they were. So she just comments, I'm not sure that I recognize the Penobscot County lake community types. And then she asks if Lincoln is represented.
Okay.
And Kathy, if you want to open up and elaborate on your question, feel free to do so if I'm not transpiring that correctly.
Well, sometimes, sure, thank you. Sometimes it's difficult to locate the cities within Penobscot County, and I was trying to identify where the dots were, if it was Penobscot County, and if you had done any surveys of the Lincoln Lakes, of which we have 13. Yay.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm well aware of those. You used to fish on those a lot. Well, certainly, I mean, this is the data that we compile. This is all from various data sources. I mean, certainly like the fish data, those lakes are well surveyed by Inland Fish and Wildlife. The plant data, most of that came from Maine Natural Areas Program. I presume they have probably done surveys in that area, but I couldn't point specifically to that data for you, other than I expect that cluster of lakes has been surveyed for at least some of these taxa.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Next in the chat box, we have a couple guesses to your question you posed there as to why insect diversity was apparently much higher than that of fish and crayfish and mussels, I believe it was. One is because they don't fly, and another answer was temperature tolerance. So do you have your own going hypotheses on why that is, Dave? Or
well, yeah, and it's hypotheses, but the first answer is correct. The fish, the mussels, and crayfish, yeah, they don't fly, and that came from a kind of another presentation I've done, kind of looking at where did these taxa come from, and of course state of Maine was glaciated up till 8 or 10,000 years ago, we didn't have any fresh waters. It was all ice. And so a lot of it is, for fish, mussels, crayfish and all, it's been a slow recruitment because they've had to repopulate essentially by swimming their way back. Whereas things like mayflies, stoneflies that I had on that graph, yeah, they can fly here. So it's much, they can distribute themselves much easier than the swimming critters.
Right. All right, good job, Pete. You win that one. So another question from Susan, and this was on the slide when you were talking about the diversity that included aquatic plants. So she asked, are the species count numbers based on obligate to water, like quillwort, for example?
That's a good question, as to whether they're obligate or facultative. And again, I'm an entomologist and a fishery biologist. I'm not a plant person. That's a good question. I assume these are obligate species that we have listed, the 130. And quillwort, certainly that would be obligate. That's a species that's definitely in, or at least there are aquatic quillworts that you wouldn't see in a terrestrial setting. But there may be other quillworts that are not. So does that answer the question adequately? I guess
Hopefully.
should be obligates, yes.
Okay.
Or we hope they are all obligates.
Okay, next question is from Kathy. Could abundance within species be measured? And if yes, would that be relevant to measuring biodiversity in Maine aquatic habitats? And Kathy, likewise, if you want to open up your mic.
I don't know if I could answer that. I mean, that looks like a discussion to have, and it's certainly not a yes or no. I'll get back to you.
Hey, Dave, it's Kathy. I was just trying, maybe I'm, in some measures of biodiversity, they always include the abundance of species and, using what is it, not Abbott's formula, some formula.
Yeah.
And you just talked about species richness, and I just thought, well, maybe in aquatic systems, it's really not relevant to even measure abundance because the habitat has so much to do with abundance. But I just wonder if you had any thoughts or, ideas about why or if you could even measure abundance of species and include that as in a measure of biodiversity.
Well, certainly, if you have both, species richness and abundance for each of the taxa, then you can calculate, there's a number of different diversity indices that are used to calculate that. This study really just focused on richness. It was species or taxa counts or, observations, and not looking at, abundance, relative abundance, anything like that. But certainly, yeah, I mean, that's kind of why in that slide I tried to differentiate, because you hear the term species diversity, but that has kind of a wide application, whereas species richness is really a count of the taxa that are present. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not. I know Leon's sitting next to you, so he can give you his answer too.
He's laughing and saying, I don't know, go ahead. He agrees.
Yeah, and that's, as I say, that's kind of why I made a point about, the term species diversity versus the term species richness, because they are related, but two really different things. And species diversity is, that can be a complicated, well, it's often a formula. It's a calculation that you have to make. Richness is simpler. and that's really what the focus of the project was.
Okay. Okay, next question, Dave, from a different Kathy. Dave, I think you mentioned there's a database that our observations could contribute to. Is that Gulf of Maine, in quotes, date? Do iNaturalist findings or citizen science efforts end up in the megadata place so we can see how they all interact?
And I think that would be wonderful. Right now, that does not occur. In fact, with the exception of the fish data, that has been updated in the biodiversity database. But the other, in terms of other groups of organisms, those have not been updated since essentially 2010. And I'm sure there are other groups that have, where there have been significant studies. One I recall sitting through, there's this project going on right now in terms of looking at whether our insect fauna is, kind of losing it or decreasing, if you will. And I sat through a presentation that was made by Frank Drummond, and I think I remember somebody mentioning, for instance, a mosquito, a recent or contemporary mosquito database, which I don't think we have in ours, and certainly these are aquatic organisms. That's one that certainly should be loaded into our database sometime. And then things like iNaturalist, yeah, I don't know how to start kind of using cloud sourcing to get more information in to this. It said that right now the study is pretty static, and we haven't figured out how to update it and include all these new sources of data that are coming in. So, good idea. If anybody wants to take it on, that'd be great.
Great. So, all right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat box right now. So I'll again invite anybody, if they want to ask Dave a question directly, go ahead on mute or raise your hand. I don't see any raised hands. So anybody out there who has another question for Dave? Oops, here's one. Dave, you compared species richness in Maine to that in North America. Do you know how Maine compares?
Well, I looked at the different groups. I mean, comparing like fish species in Maine versus, total fish species in North America. And that's kind of where I went through where, fish, crayfish, mussels, we're pretty low in terms of our relative number of taxa, whereas things like mayflies and stoneflies, given the size of the state of Maine, we seem to have a pretty robust fauna.
Another part of that question added in after now that I see is to areas that are at the same latitude. So, across the same latitude bar.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be a whole different analysis. No, we never did that. And that would be certainly a more appropriate analysis. Obviously we don't see many Arctic species down here. We wouldn't expect to, nor would, some of the subtropical species that you might see in Florida, for instance, you wouldn't expect them here. So yeah, using something like a latitude or some other kind of factor like that to limit it, yeah, it would be different. Although I expect, things like, if we looked at stoneflies in this state and at states in other latitudes, I think we would find an even higher percentage of, our species would make up a larger percentage of the total species out there. So that it actually probably would make our text look a little more robust in terms of what we have.
Yeah, I bet. Well, great. Okay, any last minute questions? Otherwise, I'll start winding us down. So yeah, thanks again, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Dave, for that presentation. That was quite interesting. So here we are in March. We have one more webinar coming up in April. That's on the 14th. So that registration form has yet to go up on the website, but keep an eye out for that, and we'll send out a reminder. That one's going to focus on ticks here in Maine, right in time for tick season, and as we all start to head out into the field. And yeah, fortunately, that'll be our last webinar of the winter series here. And yeah, it's time to stop sitting on our computers and go out and do some stuff in the real world. So we're looking forward to that. So yeah, this will be this has been recorded. So again, this will be posted on the website. Sorry for those folks that were admitted late. Yeah, if you can try to register ahead of time, I can hopefully get everybody, but otherwise I'm doing it all as we go through it. So sorry for the late admission, but anyways, with that, yeah, thanks everybody again. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon. And yes, thanks, Dave. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.